that we want you to follow along as we preach through the book of Job today. Right over here, Mr. Jeffrey needs one of those. Hey, Eric, chill, brother. If I don't plug it up, it don't work.
Fair enough.
You ought to have me now. All right, take those listening guides out, if you will, this morning. You've been faithfully attending our worship services this year. If you've been following along with the yearly Bible reading plan, then when you saw the title of the message this morning, you probably said, "What? Job?" This week I got a text from Penny, and the Faith Factory has started following us with the reading plan, and they're teaching what we're teaching out here, and that allows families to read the Bible together, to study together, and we're all following along, taking a journey through the Bible this year. And normally, as last week, the last time we preached through this series, we was talking about Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel, then all of a sudden Job. So Penny sent me a text, and she said, "Did we skip Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther? Or are we on a different path?" Well, guess what, folks? We're on a different path this morning. And so let me explain why we're taking a different path. We're not following the books of the Bible per se. We're following the Bible in a certain way for a certain reason. So, I want you to take a look at that second piece of listening guide you got this morning. It's entitled The Old Testament in Redemptive History Order. And it just kind of spells out the direction we're going this year. What you see there on that piece of paper is a thematic grouping of the books of the Old Testament, all the books of the Old Testament, moving from the creation of God's people to the establishment of God's people in the land, and the crowning of God's king, as we saw last time, as we studied through the book of Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, the next book in your Bible would be 1 Kings, correct? And 1 Kings begins the process of reversing all that with the disobedience of God's kings. And that's a story told in Kings, and then the prophets, they go on about explaining those things. Then the exile occurs, then the disestablishment of God's people, and finally the recreation of God's people. And if you don't have a copy of this, there'll be copies out in the foyer there at the Welcome Center as you leave today. You took out your Bible and take it with you. Now, if you think about it, the often termed wisdom literature in the middle of our Bibles are mostly related to God's king. Many of the Psalms were written by David, a king, whereas Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs are either credited to or closely related to David's son Solomon. These books of wisdom were for ruling well as God's kings. That's the purpose of these books, is for God's kings to rule well, even more than they were intended for God's people. They were more intended for God's kings to rule well. So we're going to take a break this morning, and for a few weeks we're going to take a break from Israel's history of kings to look at God's wisdom for those kings. Now, ironically, as we get to Job, you kind of have to forget everything I just said. Because Job wasn't written by a king. So why are we studying Job now? Well, basically because it's wisdom literature. And what we're doing is we're squeezing that into the rest of the wisdom literature, which does fit here. I think you'll agree, folks, this morning that the book of Job is timeless in its wisdom. The book of Job is timeless in its wisdom. It seems to be set around the time of Abraham, or possibly before. Based on how Job lives. We see the story of Job, we see how he's living, we can place him in and about around the time that Abraham lived, how he measures wealth, and so forth. But then, the use of the So it's a book. It's a book we don't need to fit neatly into a sequence of outside events. It's interesting that when the characters themselves speak, they almost always use the generic term for God. But when the narrator speaks of God, the narrator always uses the name of God, Yahweh. And if you're looking at your Bible, what you'll see is the Lord in all caps. So whoever compiled this knew a lot more about God than Job did. So this morning, what's Job about? What is the book of Job about? Well, fundamentally, the book of Job is about asking some of life's most important questions. Anybody got any questions about life this morning? So fundamentally, the book of Job is about asking some of life's most difficult questions. Why do the righteous suffer? In the same way, the unrighteous suffer. You ever pondered that question? Why do the wicked seem to go unpunished while many upright people suffer? How do we explain all of that? And perhaps more importantly, how should the righteous respond when we do suffer? You can tell that two things are assumed here. Number one, that God is sovereign, and number two, that God is good. Say that with me this morning. God is sovereign. God is good. Do you believe that today? Amen. I certainly hope you do. That God is sovereign, that is, God is ordaining everything that comes to pass. Say everything. Everything. Sovereign God is ordaining with His purpose everything that comes to pass. And not only is sovereign God ordaining everything that comes to pass, God is a good God. That is, He's a loving God. And He loves what is right, but He hates what is evil. The book of Job, much like the book of Ruth, as well as the book of Habakkuk, addresses the gap between our circumstances, what our circumstances seem to say about God, and then the reality of what we find in His Word of His goodness and His sovereignty. How many knows that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts? Amen. How many knows that God's ways are far higher than our ways? Amen. When we look at the lives around us, it seems that either God is not in control or God just simply doesn't care about what's good. Job is about understanding how we can trust a good and a sovereign God in the midst of unexplained suffering. Notice I didn't say that Job explains why these things happen. Yet the book is useful because it explains why bad things happen to Job. But Job never found that out, did he? Instead, the book is about how us today can trust a good and sovereign God despite the nature of our circumstances. Job, listen friends, Job is a book about trust. Amen. Job is a book about trusting a good and a sovereign God. It's not about a perfect explanation. Let me just give you a heads up. We are never going to fully understand God this side of heaven. Amen. But this side of heaven, we have been charged to lovingly trust Him in all things and in all circumstances, in all places we find ourselves in this life. Amen. And yes, even when knowing that we may never find out this side of heaven why those circumstances come to pass. So we can summarize the book of Job with this theme sentence this morning. God is completely sovereign over all the affairs of His universe. Say His universe. Yeah, it's not my universe. It's not your universe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is completely sovereign over all the affairs of His universe for His own glory, for His glory. But often, His motives, reasons, and goals behind what He does are not revealed to us, yet we find in His character and in our Redeemer reason to trust His care. Now, as we see monumental, mammoth-sized issues. Job doesn't give us simplistic or cliche answers. There's no one-to-one correspondence between evil and suffering or between righteousness and reward this side of heaven. No. Things are complicated. Can I get an amen that life is complicated? Amen. Life is sticky. And Job is dealing with this genuinely and realistically. And these issues need to be dealt with seriously, soberly, humbly, and reverently. Here we see these issues being dealt with. Friends, listen, there's real suffering in the book of Job. And very unwise attempts to answer the question of why God allows that suffering to happen. But folks, thankfully, and finally, here's what ties it all together. The voice of God is going to make things clear to us here in the book of Job. Amen? Amen. Now then, we're going to break down the book of Job this morning into 3 big pieces. Okay? Here's what we're going to be looking at today. We often suffer. Can I get an amen? Amen. We sometimes understand. Can I get an amen? Amen. But the lesson of Job is this, church. We can always trust. Amen. We can always trust God. We often suffer. We sometimes understand. We can always trust. So knowing that we're going to go through times of suffering, and we are, there's times that we understand, and there's times that we don't. But church, listen to me again. We can always trust. Amen. All right, everybody grab your fork. You ready to go? Amen. All right, God. Hey, these professional guys are taking care of this. Right now, let's take care of this. Can I get an amen? Amen. Number 1, we often suffer. We often suffer. Follow along when you're listening, guys. First, fill in the blank. We often suffer. So when we first meet Job, immediately we see that Job is a righteous man. Job is a righteous man. Look at verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless. Notice that. This man was blameless and upright. He's one that feared God, and he turned away from evil. So not only was Job righteous, but we know that Job was wealthy. And not only was Job righteous and wealthy, the Bible says that Job was a very wise man. And we see in verse 3 that Job was the greatest of all people of the East. Job is somebody. What's most well known about Job, though, is not what we just stated. What's most known about Job is Job loses everything. 8 verses chronicle his descent into utter ruin. First, he loses his wealth. Let's begin in verse 13. The Bible says, "Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck them down, the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, good grief, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you." As we know in the story of Job, on top of all this, Job loses his health in chapter 2. All of this taken in a moment of time. Turning from Job to ourselves this morning. It's worth noting that while Job probably suffered more sadly than we ever will, he certainly didn't suffer more comprehensively than what he suffered. Sir Walter Scott said this, "Come he slow or come he fast, it is but death that comes at last." We know that suffering is universal. Suffering is no respecter of persons. Yet sometimes as Christians, we sometimes avoid admitting the doubt or the fear or the anger or the conflict that suffering can bring. We love for our churches to be types of pep rallies, don't we? Yeah, we come in here and for a few moments we pretend like everything is great and wonderful, and then we go back out and start living life. But if we want to have a realistic understanding about what it means to be followers of the crucified one, since we live in the real world, we should recognize that although we may be able to psych ourselves up for a little while with rose-colored versions of Christianity, we'll never be able to convince those around us. We won't be dealing honestly with ourselves either. So what we find is Job is a good example of someone who suffers. But Job deals honestly with his sufferings, and so should we. That's the first thing we see in this book. We often suffer. Number two, we only sometimes understand. We only sometimes understand. The second statement that summarizes Job's message to us and what we're supposed to learn from this is we only sometimes understand. This is really what most of the book of Job is about. Let's pause for just a minute and let me just give you a brief overview of the rest of the book. If you flip your listing guide over on the back side is a full detailed layout of the book of Job. At the end of chapter 2, three of Job's friends come to comfort him. And they sit with him in silence for a whole week. Which is very wise of them. Finally, in chapter 3, Job breaks the silence. And he begins to pour out his complaint. Then chapters 4 through 41, all but the last chapter, are a series of dialogues. Back and forth, back and forth. Chapters 4 through 31 contain 3 cycles of dialogues between Job and his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. In cycles 1 and 2, Eliphaz speaks and Job responds. In the next cycle, speaks and Job responds. And in the third, Zophar speaks and Job responds. Really, each of Job's friends make the same point. And here's their point. They all agree that Job's sufferings has happened because Job is at fault. Because Job has sinned. Yet Job disagrees by saying, listen up, guys. I'm innocent in all this. Then at the end of the third cycle, Job makes his final protest. He almost demands that God shows up and gives him an explanation. So he's had enough. Will you please explain to me, God, what is happening? But instead of God doing that, we hear from a young man named Elihu, who appears in chapter 32 and speaks all the way to chapter 37. He says he's been listening for some time but hasn't said anything because he's younger and he doesn't want to disrespect his elders. But he's not happy with anybody in the crowd. He believes there's been far too much reflecting and pointing at Job and not enough looking to where they should have been looking all along, to God. So he gives 4 monologues on the greatness of God's justice and mercy, which are beyond our human understanding. He challenges Job to consider that his sufferings might be, listen folks, listen, this is monumental. Get this. He challenges Job to consider that that Job's sufferings might be in some way be the deliberate acts of a loving God. That God may be doing this on purpose in His sovereignty and in His goodness for Job's good, for our good, and for His glory. And he concludes by saying in chapter 37, verses 23 and 24, the Almighty, we cannot find Him. He is great in power, justice, and abundant righteousness. He will not violate. Therefore men fear Him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. Finally, in chapter 38, God Himself enters the discussion and criticizes those who have darkened counsel. He says, with words without knowledge. And one of the Bible's most remarkable passages, what God does is He paints a picture for Job and the others of His unique and sovereign power. At one point, here's what God says. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? And we know who does that. Who is that? Sovereign, good God. Amen? Amen. God looks at the natural world and considers the many things He's made, from seas to stars and from ostriches to oxen. Then in chapter 40, God asked Job a direct question. He said, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. To which Job's response is simple. He says, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once. I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. To which God replies in chapter 40, verse 8 through 11, will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like His? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase Him. Then in the remainder of chapters 40 and 41, God continues to instruct Job and the others about who He is. Who He is. Chapter 41, 10 and 11. Who then is he who can stand before me? To which I say, not I. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. Can I get an amen? Amen. Chapter 42, the last chapter, Job makes his final confession. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see. Therefore I despise myself. I repent. God, I, the human, the lesser one, the weaker one, the frail one, I repent in dust and ashes. So the story ends here in chapter 42 with God telling Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, guess what, guys? You're wrong. I'm God and you're not. He says that what Job has said about himself, God, is true. And then God blesses Job. There's some interesting things that God does not say that we're going to get to in just a moment. But that's a summary of the book. So let's get back to that second theme that we're running on right now. We only sometimes understand. Now, Job's friends, they maintain that we can always understand why we suffer. That's what they're standing on. Their arguments can basically be summarized this way. Job, what's happened to you is really bad. You must have sinned in an extraordinary way, Job, because God's just. And though you and I haven't sinned, we know you must have. There can be no other explanation, Job. You've sinned, and you're getting what you deserve. And every single time, Job basically responds, no, this cannot be because of my sin. And it's not that he never sinned. He's not claiming sinlessness. But He knows. He knows that there's no great hidden sin that's marked His life that should bring on this amount of calamity in His life. Job's friends keep coming back to the basic idea. Well, Job, you know you reap what you sow. The response is like the response of Jesus' disciples in John chapter 9, verse 2, where they say, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And they're every bit as right as the disciples. And we sympathize with them, can't we, folks? They wanted to know why this could have happened to their friend Job. They didn't deny the reality of the material world like the Christian scientist or the Buddhist who says, in essence, suffering isn't real. And they couldn't abandon their orthodoxy by rejecting God's justice or His sovereignty. So this is what they were left with. Here's what it's boiled down to. Here's what it's reduced down to. How can an innocent Job suffer in the world of a God who is both sovereign and just? Logically speaking, something has to give here, right? And Job's innocence would be the first to go. Now, in our world, people give up on all three of these pillars. Some deny the reality of suffering, as I just mentioned. Some think God is well-intentioned, but He's unable to protect us. Others deny His goodness or His justice. But church, listen, only the religion of the Bible has the audacity to maintain that all four can be true. We went from 3 to 4, I understand that. The reality of Job's suffering. God's sovereignty. God's goodness. And yet also Job's innocence. I'll repeat those one more time. The reality of Job's suffering, God's sovereignty, God's goodness, and yet also Job's innocence. I think you agree with me this morning. We all have those same tendencies, don't we? We all assume that at some level the right to understand what God is doing through suffering. So when we ask the question, why in suffering, we don't do it humbly. We do it out of anger. How dare God do this to us since we followed Him so faithfully? I guess my trust in God didn't work out for me like it did others. But why do we expect this kind of knowledge? That's the point of Job. That's the point of the book of Job. Perhaps more than anything else, Job teaches us we never have all the facts. We only see what we can see. We only hear what we can hear. We can only perceive what we can perceive. But a sovereign, good God, who is sitting on His throne in heaven, who exists outside of time, He has all the facts. And we trust Him. Church, we trust Him.
Amen.
In a moment, we'll look at the interchange between God and Satan. And we'll find the answers to why he suffered. But Job never had the luxury of knowing that, did he? And God never explained it to him. There's nothing like, oh, Job, I'm so sorry for these troubles you've been going through. Let me tell you what happened, Job. Satan came along and he said, and so I said, and you see, that dialogue never took place between God and Job, did it? Yet Job trusted sovereign, good God. So Job's friends didn't understand why Job suffered. Job didn't understand why he suffered. And the only reason we understand why Job suffered is why? Because God took the time to explain it to us so we could understand it and better trust it. So the book of Job isn't about understanding why evil happens. Rather, it's simply telling us that only sometimes we understand. Only sometimes. So if we don't get what we want, what Job wanted, an explanation, how can we continue to live faithful lives? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that leads us to point number 3. We often suffer. Amen?
Amen.
We only sometimes understand. Amen? But we can always trust. We can always trust. Will you write this down this morning? Because this will carry you through some dark times. Write this down. Faith exists because understanding doesn't. Faith exists because understanding doesn't. If we insist on living only according to our own understanding and completely apart from trust, then we can't call ourselves Christian. Let this sink in. If we insist on living only according to our own understanding and completely apart from trust, then we can't call ourselves Christians. We need to know how to trust God. How did you get into the kingdom of God? How was you born again? How did you escape the wrath of God? What happened in that process that took you from dead in your trespasses and sins to washed in the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, made alive in Him for all of eternity? How did that happen? It happened through one word. It happened through trust. Listen to a sermon this week, and I'll get right back at this. Bless my heart richly. You know, we just got through studying through the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers and such. And remember at one time God got really angry with the nation of Israel when they were there in the desert, and He sent snakes in amongst them. And the snakes started biting them and started dying. And He told Moses, He said, Moses, I want you to craft this serpent, and I want you to lift it up and nail it to a tree. And you instruct the people that when they look upon that serpent, they shall live. Fast forward to the New Testament. Jesus is having this interaction, this interchange with a man by the name of Nicodemus, who's come to Him by night to try to find out what's going on. And Jesus begins to explain to Nicodemus, Nicodemus, I know you're a religious man, but you've got to be a righteous man. And the only way you can be righteous is for you to be born again. Nicodemus goes, that kind of be hard. How can I go a second time into my mother's womb and be born again? You are the fool they said you are. How's that going to happen? And Jesus continues to explain, hey, the water, the new birth, the Spirit goes and comes as God instructs it to. Then finally Jesus just kind of draws the line. He says, listen, I'm from heaven, you're not from heaven. I understand, you can't understand because you're dead in your trespasses and sins. Let me make it easy for you. You're a religious man. You remember the guy Moses in the Old Testament? Remember when God sent the snakes in there? And you remember how that God instructed Moses to lift up a serpent and nail it to a tree? And when the people look at that serpent, they'll live. Well, listen, Nicodemus. Here's the Father's plan. Here's the Father's will. Just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, here's what Jesus said. So must I be lifted up on a tree. And as you look upon me and believe, trust, you shall live. Trust. Trust got us in this. Trust will carry us through. And trust will get us into glory, church. And that's what the book of Job is all about. The good news is, we have a basis for that trust, and that basis is God's power. Say God's power with me this morning. God's power. And some of the most beautiful poetry you'll ever read The book of Job displays the power of God, the one we're called to trust. Like the other great Old Testament books that grapple with the problem of suffering, we never find an explanation. But we do understand more of who God is. And in that knowledge, we find the evidence we need to base our trust. We see His creation of all things. We consider His power. We see His competency. We observe His providence in caring for everything He's created, particularly His care for us, His care for me, His care for you. And we know He's the only one who can be trusted. As I said, Job never understands why he suffered. What he is given is knowledge about who God is. And Job trusted that God. But aren't we so much more blessed? Because not only do we have the knowledge, we have the explanation, and we can trust God, can't we? Because God lets us peek behind the scenes so we can understand why Job suffered. That's the heavenly court scene in chapter 1. Now in that scene, Satan is wrong. Can I get an amen? Amen. Satan accuses Job of serving God for his own selfish ends. That's chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. Satan says that Job serves God because God has made him wealthy. But God knows that Satan's wrong because Satan is always wrong. Amen? Amen. But he allows Satan to take away Job's wealth. And guess what? Job keeps trusting God without the wealth. But Satan's never been the one to be put off because he's wrong. So he accuses Job of serving God only because his health remains. Oh, surely, Satan says, you can take everything a man has, but if you touch his body, then you'll find out what he really cares about. Then he will curse you to your face, Satan says to God. Again, God allows Satan to do what he asks, taking away Job's health. And guess what? He still worships God. He still trusts God. Job's changing circumstances reveal that as wealthy as he is, Job's not worshiping God because of his wealth. And as healthy as he is, he's not worshiping God because of his health. The true worship of God doesn't depend on our circumstances. I'm going to say that one more time. And I expect a big, loud, hearty, heartfelt amen. The true worship of God doesn't happen because or doesn't depend upon our circumstances. Amen. We can certainly give Him thanks for good circumstances. True worship is a response to who God is regardless of our circumstances. In fact, that brings us to one of the central ironies of this book. I hope you've noticed it. Most of the book consists of Job's friends saying to him, hey, Job, I know you look virtuous, but there must be some sin in there. They were so wrong, weren't they? Someone should have said to them, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, this suffering might have come on you had you been more virtuous. Had you been more righteous. Had you been more trusting, you might have been blessed enough to receive what Job has received. Job faced this suffering not because of his vices, but because of his virtue. Now, friends, we're going somewhere. Just sit tight. We're going somewhere. We're going to find out what the book of Job is really about. That was why all the things God could have bragged about before Satan chose Job. What does this mean for us, church? It simply means we don't trust God because we're so clever or holy, but because God's character is worthy. Amen. That was the only basis for trust that Job was ever given. I'm God, sovereign, and I'm good. Love me. Trust me. Job never read Job chapter 1. The only thing Job was given given was the character and the trustworthiness of Almighty God. Essentially, God says, Job, look out the window at this beauty of my creation. And let that be enough information about my goodness and power to enable you to trust me while I rip your world to pieces. So Job trusted. Because God is sovereign. Because God is good. Think of how much more we know about God's character than Job had the luxury of knowing about. How much more evidence we have to trust God. Let's get from his vantage point to ours. We move into the Gospels. And we read of the greatest injustice ever perpetrated in the history of the universe. The murder of an innocent, only begotten Son of God. And we see how God used it for the greatest of good ever conceived. His glory through the salvation of mankind from our sins. So statements about suffering in the New Testament can point back to this pivotal event, can't it? If God can use even this for the greatest good, how much confidence do we have in his good purpose in our own suffering? Here's what we know. Here's what we need to know most about God. Is that God is good.
Amen.
And you say,
Amen.
no. Amen's good. But when preacher says God is good
All the time.
and when you say all the time, preacher says
God is good.
He's sovereign. We love him. We trust him because he has proven himself from the foundation of the world till the time we go home to be with him. He's given us the story of the Word of God that he's sovereign, he's good, and he loves us. And in the midst of suffering, he's glorified and we're growing. We trust him. Romans 8:32 speaks loudly. Listen to this verse. He who did not spare his own Son. The God who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Patterns set in Job is what we get throughout the entire Bible. So how does the suffering of God's people jive with his sovereignty and mercy? Listen. Listen. Are you listening?
Yes.
There is no explanation. There's only a call to trust. Amen. There's only a call to trust. God, you're good. God, you're sovereign. God, I trust you. And yet through the centuries, compounding more and more evidence on which to base that trust, culminating in the suffering of Jesus Christ and his glory. At times, God graciously allows us to see how he used a different situation for our good. And surely we should thank him for the consolation those moments of understanding bring us. But there's great danger in assuming that he must give us understanding. God, I'm not moving until you give me the plan. And God says, well, just pack some food. You're going to be there too. Sadly, what will follow is a counterfeit trust. When we demand full understanding before we move, that's a counterfeit trust. And a trust in our own abilities to figure out what all of God's purpose is within any particular trial. Rather than trusting God and His character as He's finally revealed in the person of Jesus Christ on the cross, the only one who's worthy of our trust is not ourselves, nor is it our own clever ability to figure it out. It's God Himself. We can trust God because Job said, right in the midst of all this, listen to what Job said. For I know that my Redeemer lives. Amen. And at the last, He will stand upon the earth. How would Job's Redeemer redeem? Job's Redeemer was redeemed by living more righteously and perfectly than Job ever could. And by taking upon Himself more suffering than Job would ever know. Job's patience amid suffering, you see, was finally meant to point to the genuinely righteous, perfect, and wholly undeserved suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross. Job is saying suffering brings about great good, just like Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, suffering on the cross brought about good to us that we could not figure out on our own. Here's what we have to change our mind about. Suffering is a good thing. Now listen, I didn't say suffering is an enjoyable thing. I said suffering is a good thing because it's in the sufferings that we grow to love and trust Him more. Amen. Through His death on the cross and His resurrection on the third day, Christ would defeat the powers of sin and death. We go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and the curse and the two seeds. The plan is unfolding, and the plan is unfolding, and the plan is unfolding. And we have the luxury of having the Gospels of knowing that it has occurred. And we're on this side of it looking back saying, praise Jesus, that God's plan has been fulfilled. Mm-hmm. Mentioned earlier the story of the disciples asking Jesus regarding the blind man. There in John chapter 9, and they ask this question, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Apparently, they're asking the wrong question. Jesus said, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Had he not been born blind, God couldn't have showed up and healed him of his blindness for His good and for God's glory. Everything has purpose when God is sitting on the throne of our lives, church. Everything has purpose for our good and for His glory. God intends to display His glory in your life and in the lives of everybody around you. You can absolutely be certain of this. You can deposit that in the bank and write the biggest check you got. Now, how He specifically intends to do this would take us throughout the other books of the Bible. But within the context of Job, we can see this very clearly that God intends to display His glory in the lives of His children as they continue to serve Him amongst life's trials. So the next time trial comes knocking at the door, say, oh goody, let's get our knees. Something grand is about to take place in life. I'm going to suffer, but God's going to see me through. I trust Him. And on the other side of this, He will be glorified, and the folks around me will see His glory working in me and through me, carrying me through this, and I will react the way I'm supposed to react. I will trust sovereign, good God. So if you're God's child this morning, if you've been reconciled through Jesus Christ, realize something this morning. That your very suffering can exquisitely display the glory of God as you serve and worship Him in a way that defies the world's comprehension and abilities. If you as a Christian are presently enduring a season of suffering, it may be that God is sitting in heaven right now and saying to the heavenly host that surrounds Him, have you considered Steve? Have you considered Jeffrey? Have you considered Curtis? Have you considered Joe? Have you considered Mike? His honor? His glory? Could it be that one day you'll watch as God shows to all creation the presently unrevealed glories of what He's done by making you in His image and remaking you as His child. We often suffer. We only sometimes understand. And by God's grace, you can always trust.
Amen.
Would you stand with me this morning?